She was barely 20, her hands still rough from scrubbing floors, when the deal was struck. A man older than her father, rich in cattle, cruel in silence, claimed her as his wife. The wedding was not celebration but sentence, her veil a shroud of innocence stolen. Townsfolk muttered but turned their eyes away, too fearful of his wealth, too weary to intervene. Yet what none of them expected was that within days of the vows, her courage and his sins would tear through the frontier like a thunderclap, leaving the whole settlement reeling in shock. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The oil lamps flickered low along the rough-hewn beams of the ranch house, throwing long shadows across the wooden table where platters of food lay untouched, their steam rising in ghostly tendrils that curled into the silence. And the girl, barely 20, her dress too heavy for her small frame, her hands still raw from the lie of endless scrubbing, sat stiff and silent, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the man across from her, as if she might pierce through the walls and escape into the open prairie if only she stared long enough. Her new husband leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath his weight, his voice thick and self-satisfied as he spoke of his herds, of the land he had fenced from horizon to horizon, of the men who worked under his word and the profits that rolled in with every cattle drive. Each sentence not a conversation but a declaration of ownership. Not just over his ranch, but over her. The cadence of his words heavy with control, each boast like a bar hammered into the invisible cage he had already built around her. He did not look at her as a partner but as a possession, pausing only to refill his glass with whiskey, the amber liquid catching the lamplight as he spoke with the surety of a man who had never been told no, who mistook silence for obedience and fear for respect. And though the plates between them held roasted meat, beans, bread still warm from the oven, her stomach churned too tightly to eat, her throat locked around the weight of vows she had never chosen, vows spoken not out of love but out of power wielded in the guise of marriage. The townsfolk had muttered in the days before the wedding, shaking their heads at the age gap, whispering about his reputation for cruelty, about the women who had worked in his house and left in whispers of bruises and shame. But none had spoken aloud. None had dared stand in the way of wealth and land. And so the church bells had tolled and the preacher had blessed what everyone knew was no union but a sentence. Her veil not a promise of new life but a shroud draped over innocence stolen. Now, in the hollow quiet of their first night, she sat with her hands clenched tightly in her lap, nails biting into her palms, her silence louder than his endless boasting, her gaze fixed past him into a horizon only she could see, where perhaps freedom still lived, where perhaps she was not yet the caged bird he imagined. He talked of calves fattening in spring, of deals struck with drovers, of fences mended, his pride sprawling across the table like another guest. But beneath his drawl there lingered a menace, a warning woven through each word, a reminder that he held the keys to everything she now touched: her bed, her bread, her very breath beneath his roof. And though he never raised his voice, though he never lifted his hand, the cruelty in his silence between boasts was worse than any shout, for it told her that defiance would be met not with anger but with cold, calculated punishment. Outside, the wind moaned against the shutters, carrying the scent of dust and cattle, and she thought of the life she had left behind: the scrubbed floors, the small wages, the freedom of walking home at dusk with no man's claim upon her, and she felt the weight of the ring on her finger like a shackle forged of gold, gleaming in the lamplight but cold against her skin. She did not weep, though the tears pricked at her eyes, for even now, even trapped in the cage without walls he had built, something inside her refused to break. A small, stubborn flame banked deep in her chest, silent but unyielding, and though her new husband spoke as though the world bent to his will, she sat in that silence, knowing that storms did not announce themselves until the first crack of thunder split the sky. The old man lingered at the edge of the corral the morning after the wedding, his shoulders hunched beneath a faded coat that had weathered more seasons than his pride could bear, the dust curling up around his boots as cattle shifted lazily in the pen. But his eyes never really saw the herd, for his gaze, though he tried to keep it fixed on anything else, was pulled again and again toward the ranch house where his daughter now lived, her veil folded away somewhere like a burial shroud, her youth and laughter already buried with it. He had told himself, in the weeks leading up to that cursed day, that it was necessity, that the debts had grown too large, that the men who pressed him for coin were not patient men, and when the offer came from the cattle baron older than him by a decade, rich in land and ruthless in silence, he had clutched at it like a drowning man grasping a rope, telling himself it was mercy, telling himself it was providence that a man of means would take her hand in exchange for clearing the slate. But now, standing in the pale light of morning with the taste of whiskey still sour on his tongue, he knew those were lies, weak excuses to cover the truth that he had sold his daughter into sorrow, bartered her like a calf at auction for the price of his own survival, and the shame of it weighed heavier than any coin purse could, sinking deep into his bones until even the thought of meeting her eyes made him sick. He remembered her as a child, her hands raw from scrubbing floors but her laugh still bright as spring water, remembered how she once dreamed of a small patch of land of her own, of chickens and a garden and a husband close to her own years who might see her not as a possession but as a partner, and the memory stabbed at him until he clenched his fists tight enough to whiten his knuckles. For now those dreams lay smothered beneath a man's wealth, and he was the one who had done the smothering. When she passed him in town before the wedding, her gaze steady though her lips said nothing, he had avoided her eyes, looking instead at the ruts in the road or the cracked boards of the storefronts, because he knew what he would see there: betrayal, sorrow, the weight of a trust broken beyond mending, and he had not the courage to face it. Now, even after the vows had been spoken, after the preacher had blessed what should never have been blessed, he kept his distance, haunting the ranch's edges like a ghost, unable to stay away and yet too ashamed to draw close, torn between the gnawing need to protect her and the knowledge that he had forfeited any right to do so the moment he let greed and desperation guide his hand. The townsfolk muttered of his gain, some envying the clearing of his debts, others whispering that no man with pride would sell his own flesh and blood, but he heard none of it over the echo of her silence at the altar, the way she had stood stiff as a post, her veil trembling with every breath, and he wondered if she had cursed him in her heart then, if she cursed him still now in the hollow halls of her husband's house. The cattle lowed, the wind tugged at his coat, but none of it reached him, only the gnawing weight of shame, heavier than iron, pressing down with every thought. And though his pockets were lighter for the first time in years, the coins no longer owed. His soul had grown so burdened he feared it might buckle him to the dirt before long. And still he did not dare seek her gaze, for he knew that one look from her would be enough to unravel him completely. The saloon's doors swung on their tired hinges that evening, letting in the amber glow of lanterns and the low hum of voices, a murmur that spread like smoke through the haze of tobacco and spilled whiskey. Men leaned on the bar, their boots scuffing the sawdust floor, some speaking in tones just loud enough to be heard, others shaking their heads with mock sympathy as they spoke of the girl barely 20, now bound to a man older than her father, a man known more for the iron in his hand than any kindness in his heart. A few muttered that it was a shame, that she'd looked too young and too pale standing beside him at the altar, but their pity was shallow, fleeting, easily washed down with another swallow of rye, and more than one shrugged as if to brush the whole affair off with the same words that had excused 100 cruelties before. That's the way of the frontier where land spoke louder than love, and a girl's future could be traded like cattle if debts were heavy enough. The piano in the corner plunked out a tired tune, but it could not drown the whispers, nor could the clinking of glasses mask the way certain glances carried weight, particularly from the women who sat along the edges of the room, their dresses worn but their eyes sharp, exchanging looks that held more truth than any of the men's careless words. Their silence was not indifference but solidarity, the kind that ran deep and unspoken, for they too had felt the cage close in around them, had known the price of being bound to men whose power was measured not in love but in land. And in their stillness, in the way they pressed their lips thin and folded their hands in their laps, there was a quiet storm brewing that none of the men noticed. One woman, older, her hair streaked with gray, whispered to another that the girl had once worked beside her at the laundry, her fingers red and raw but her laugh quick and bright, and that it had gone silent in her on the very day her father made the bargain words carried with a sorrow that only another woman would understand. Still, most of the room drowned such sentiment beneath the clatter of dice and the scrape of chairs, eager to let the matter fade. For in a land where every man carried debts of one kind or another, who was to judge how they were paid? Yet even as they tried to let it pass, the story clung to the air like smoke, the knowledge that innocence had been bartered for survival gnawing at those who pretended not to care. And when the Baron's name was spoken, voices dropped lower still, for none dared accuse him outright. None dared speak too boldly of his cruelty, not with his men lingering near the doorway, their eyes sweeping the room like wolves on guard. And so the whispers carried on in hushed tones, pity and resignation tangled together, while at the fringes of it all the women sat in their silence, their glances sharp as knives unsheathed in the dark, as though they alone remembered that storms begin not with thunder but with the first stillness of the air, the kind that makes the skin prickle and the heart quicken in warning of what's to come. It was only a handful of days after the vows, yet already the girl's steps bore the story her lips refused to tell. She moved across the yard with a limp she tried to hide, her skirts brushing the dirt as if to mask the falter in her stride, her sleeve tugged down too far for the warmth of the day, her chin dipped low. But even her careful silence could not conceal the truth from watchful eyes. A neighbor woman, fetching water from her own well across the fence line, paused when the girl lifted her head, just enough to reveal the edge of a bruise blooming dark against her cheek, the kind no accident could explain, no stumble against a post or fall in the corral could disguise. And in that instant the neighbor felt the air shift, heavy with the weight of a secret too dangerous to name aloud. She said nothing, not with her lips, but her eyes lingered, searching the girl's face for a flicker of acknowledgement, a silent question, was it him? And the girl, her mouth set in a line too steady for one so young, looked back only for a moment before lowering her gaze again. Her silence answer enough. By nightfall, whispers began to snake through town, carried in kitchens and across laundry lines, muttered in corners of the general store, the quiet speculation sharpened by the memory of the Baron's reputation and the girl's sudden pallor. Some dismissed it with a shrug, calling it the lot of wives to endure what men's tempers dealt, but others lowered their voices with unease. For though the frontier was cruel, there was cruelty that stained even the hard-bitten hearts of those who claimed it as home. The bruise was not merely a mark on her skin, it was a crack in the facade, a sign that what had been bargained in coin was already being paid in blood, and the sight of it unsettled even those too timid to speak. In the saloon, men muttered that perhaps she had grown clumsy, that young girls had to learn the ways of keeping house, yet their words were brittle, lacking conviction, for they too had seen the Baron's hard eyes, had heard the silence between his boasts, and knew that some cages did not wait long to show their bars. The women, meanwhile, exchanged sharper glances than before, their silence deepening into something taut, something dangerous, for the bruise was a language they all understood, one written on skin too many of them had worn before, and though none dared voice it outright, they carried the knowledge like smoldering coals, waiting for the moment they might burst into flame. The girl herself moved through it all with a quiet endurance, her head bowed, her sleeve tugged down, but her eyes, when they lifted even for a heartbeat, still carried that ember of defiance, that unbroken flicker that refused to yield completely, and those who saw it could not easily forget, for it promised that her silence, though deep, would not last forever, and that the frontier itself, already restless under the weight of her husband's cruelty, might one day split open beneath the thunder of truths too long ignored. The first man to break the silence was a ranch hand, rough-faced and honest, who had worked seasons long enough to know when cruelty crossed lines even the frontier should not excuse. He had seen the girl limp through the yard, had caught the shadow of bruises hidden poorly beneath sleeves, and one evening, driven by a conscience heavier than his fear, he rode into town and laid the matter plain before the sheriff, his voice steady though his hands fidgeted at his hat brim. But the words fell on ears, deafened not by ignorance but by coin. The sheriff leaned back in his chair, boots propped on his desk, listening with a kind of smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth, and when the hand had finished, the lawman gave a lazy shrug, saying only that a man's home was his castle, his wife, his business, and that no deputy worth his badge would waste time meddling in the private dealings of a husband, especially one who happened to be the wealthiest cattleman in 3 counties. The ranch hand's face tightened, his jaw clenching as he pressed again, insisting that this was more than a quarrel, that the girl was little more than a child herself. But the sheriff's eyes went cold then, the smirk fading into a warning, and he told the hand that if he valued his job, his place in this town, He'd best keep his mouth shut and his head down. For men who talked too much often found themselves without work or worse, without a roof to sleep under. The hand left in silence, his fists knotted tight around his hat, his heart heavy with helpless rage, and by the time he returned to the bunkhouse that night, he knew his words had been less a defense than a nail driven into his own coffin. For the Baron's wealth lined too many pockets, paid too many wages, bought too much silence in this corner of the frontier. Justice here was not blind but bought, and the girl barely 20. Her courage cloaked in silence was left unprotected. Her suffering weighed against ledger books and found not worth the trouble. Word of the hand's attempt spread in whispers, carried by those who had overheard in the saloon, and though some praised him as brave, others shook their heads and said he had been a fool to think the sheriff would ever bite the hand that fattened the town. For everyone knew law bent where coin pressed hard enough. The girl, when she heard of it through hushed voices at the well, did not flinch nor smile, but a shadow passed over her face, not of surprise but of grim confirmation, as though she had expected no less, as though she had already known that the badge on the sheriff's chest was nothing more than polished tin, covering a hollow heart. Yet even in that grimness, something stirred a tightening in her jaw, a sharpness in her eyes that spoke of truths taking root in silence, truths that, once grown, might tear through the town like storm winds. For now, though, the sheriff's indifference had done its work, and the girl remained alone beneath the roof of a man who saw her not as wife but possession. The weight of the frontier's law turned firmly against her, its price paid in her bruises, its silence written across her skin. The night was heavy with heat, the air in the ranch house thick and still, as if even the wind dared not stir. And when the cattle baron strode in from the yard, boots caked with dust, he expected the same sight he had come to take for granted. His young wife waiting in silence, head bowed, hands busy with whatever task he had set her to. But this night, when he barked his order demanding his supper be hotter, the floor cleaner, her voice quieter, she did not lower her gaze, did not shrink beneath the weight of his command. Instead, she stood rigid by the long wooden table, her chin lifted, her eyes fixed squarely on him with a steadiness that froze him mid-step. For in that unyielding stare was something he had never seen from her before, something that stripped the smug ease from his tongue resolve, sharp and cold as a blade. His rage flared hot, rising quick as prairie fire, his face darkening, his fists tightening at his sides as he stepped toward her, spitting threats through clenched teeth, boasting that he owned the roof above her head, the food she ate, even the air she breathed, that her silence meant submission, and her obedience was not choice but duty bought and paid for. But the girl did not waver, did not flinch, and though her lips held no words, her silence struck harder than any argument, for it was no longer the silence of fear but of defiance, a refusal to yield cloaked in stillness, a weapon fashioned out of the very tool he had used to bind her. He raised his hand as if to strike, his knuckles white with fury, but in her eyes he saw not the cowering girl he had claimed but something unbroken, something that promised if he touched her again it would not pass quietly as before. And the weight of that unspoken promise stayed his hand even as his anger trembled for release. The lamps flickered in the draft of his breath, the boards creaked under his boots, and for the first time since he had claimed her, the house felt less like his dominion and more like contested ground, the air thick with a power he had not expected. A girl barely 20, with no coin, no land, no law to defend her, yet standing taller in silence than he could in all his wealth. He snarled, turned away, poured himself whiskey with hands that trembled just enough to betray him, and drank deep as if to drown the unease creeping into his chest, while she remained unmoved, her gaze never breaking until he looked away first. When at last she slipped into the shadows of her room, her heart thundered in her chest, but it was not fear that raced in her blood, it was the fierce, dizzying knowledge that she had stood her ground, that she had wielded her silence not as a shield but as a weapon, and though the night stretched long and uncertain before her, for the first time she knew the cage without walls was not unbreakable, that a single spark of defiance could rattle even the thickest bars, and that resolve, once lit, could burn hotter than any man's rage. It was in the hush of a moonless night that she stole away, her bare feet silent against the dirt path as she slipped beyond the reach of the ranch house, beyond the echo of his heavy tread, her heart hammering so hard she feared it might wake the whole town. The church sat on the hill, its steeple a shadow against the stars, and there she found the preacher's wife tending the lamps within, a kind-eyed woman who had long watched the girl with quiet sorrow. When the girl's trembling hands clasped hers and the words tumbled out, not in steady speech but in bursts of sobs and silences, the tale that unfolded was heavier than any sermon ever preached in those walls, the bruises she concealed beneath sleeves, the rage she endured in silence, the way her husband's cruelty pressed down like iron, suffocating every breath of youth left in her. The preacher's wife, her own face lined with the weight of years, held her close, whispering comfort and prayers, but more than that she listened. And when dawn broke, she carried the burden of that confession not only in her heart but in the quiet network of women who passed truths along in kitchens and back rooms, truths too dangerous to say aloud in daylight, but too heavy to keep locked in the dark. By the week's end, whispers had woven themselves into the town's fabric, carried in hushed voices over laundry lines, in the hush of sewing circles, over the rattle of dishes washed behind shuttered windows, and though none dared speak it openly where the Baron's men could hear, the story traveled fast, each telling fanning the embers of outrage and sorrow, yet whispers never travel alone, and soon they brushed the ears of men who had long nursed grudges against her husband, drovers he had cheated, rivals cut off from water rights, laborers paid late or not at all, and for them, the story of the girl was not only tragedy but opportunity, a chance to strike at a man whose wealth had shielded him for too long. The town began to change in its silence, the saloon's laughter sharper, the glances longer, the air heavy with something unspoken but gathering, like thunderheads on the horizon. The girl herself returned to the ranch before dawn, slipping back into the role of silent wife with her husband, none the wiser. But inside her chest a new flame burned. She was no longer utterly alone, for her suffering now lived in other hearts, carried by other voices. And though she knew danger sharpened with every whispered word, she also knew that storms did not grow in silence. Alone they needed air. They needed space to gather, and her confession had given them both. The preacher's wife prayed for her safety, but even in prayer there was a tremor of resolve. For the women who carried her story did not pray only for mercy, they prayed for reckoning. And the men who listened with grudges simmering knew that soon enough, silence would not be able to hold. It happened in the broad light of day, when the whole town had gathered near the square for the auction of supplies brought in by the freight wagons, men haggling over sacks of flour, and women counting out their coins for bolts of calico, the chatter and clatter of daily life weaving a fragile peace across the dusty street until he arrived, towering on the steps of the Mercantile, his hat tilted back, his voice booming over the crowd as if the town itself belonged to him. At his side, she moved quietly, her hands folded, her eyes lowered. The practiced stillness of a wife taught her place. But when she faltered, her steps slowing, her answer too quiet, her glance not obedient enough, his hand came down across her face with a crack that seemed to split the day in two. She staggered back, her cheek blossoming red beneath the slap, and for a heartbeat the square went silent. Every voice stilled, every breath caught in the throat of a people too used to swallowing their discomfort, too afraid to challenge the weight of land and money that stood in boots before them. Yet this time, the silence did not slink back into cowardice. It thickened, it hardened, it burned. For the girl's suffering was no longer hidden behind walls and sleeves, no longer a rumor whispered in kitchens, but laid bare before every eye in town, her pain ringing louder than the echo of his hand. The cattle baron, chest heaving with his own fury, looked out over the crowd as if daring them to object, his glare sweeping across men who owed him coin, women who feared his power, neighbors who had long pretended not to see, and he smirked when none spoke, mistaking their silence for submission once more. But what he did not see was the stiffening of shoulders, the narrowing of eyes, the way women reached for one another's hands, the way men shifted uneasily, some biting back words they had swallowed too many times, their jaws working like coiled springs. The girl, standing upright despite the sting in her cheek, lifted her chin and fixed her gaze on him, unbroken, unyielding, and that silent defiance, sharp and steady, passed through the crowd like a spark leaping from dry grass to tinder. And though no one spoke, though no one moved, the air itself seemed to tremble with the outrage simmering to the surface. She was no longer only the Baron's wife, No longer only a girl trapped in a cage without walls, she had become the mirror of the town's own fear, the living testament to their cowardice. And in her silence they saw their complicity, their shame, their long years of looking away. And so the square, though outwardly quiet, had changed. Beneath the stillness ran a current fierce and undeniable, the birth of something that could not be turned back. For once, a bruise is laid bare in daylight. Once a man's cruelty strikes not in shadows but in the face of his neighbors, silence ceases to be protection and becomes instead the seed of rebellion. And as she stood there, cheek burning, eyes bright with resolve, every soul in that crowd knew the frontier had reached its breaking point, and that before long the thunder would break. The night the uprising began, the moon hung thin as a scythe over the prairie, its pale glow mingling with the harsh orange of torches that flickered in the fists of townsfolk gathered outside the Baron's sprawling house. Their voices rose not in timid whispers now, but in sharp, unflinching cries, the women at the front, their faces lit fierce in the firelight, demanding that the girl be released from the cage of vows and bruises that bound her, their words cutting through the darkness with the weight of years spent watching in silence, years that had broken on the sight of her struck down in daylight, her defiance too bright to ignore. Men stood behind them, some shifting uneasily, others tight-jawed, their grudges against the Baron rekindled by the bruises on her cheek, by the memory of debts unpaid, of water stolen, of dignity trampled beneath the boots of a man who thought himself untouchable. The Baron's shutters were dark, the ranch house looming like a fortress, but inside every board and brick seemed to groan with the echo of the crowd outside, their fury building like storm winds against the walls, their torches spitting sparks that drifted upward as if the very night sky were ready to ignite. At the edge of the gathering, in the half-shadow near the corral, the sheriff sat his horse, his face carved in stone, watching with eyes that betrayed the storm within him, his pocket heavy with the Baron's coin, his past lined with favors paid and debts bound tight to the man inside the house. Yet before him, the people, the same people who gave his badge its power, stood united in a way he had never seen, their outrage hotter than fire, their fury sharper than any law he could quote. He felt the pull of both worlds, the weight of the wealth that fed him, clothed him, kept his office in his hand, and the weight of the people's anger, which threatened now to strip that office from him entirely if he turned against them. And for the first time in years, the lawman's silence tasted bitter, not safe but dangerous. For whichever side he chose, it would mark him forever. The preacher's wife stood at the front of the crowd, her voice steady as she called out that the Lord did not bless cruelty, that vows made in blood and fear were no vows at all, and her words carried like a bell through the gathered souls, drawing murmurs of assent, nods from men who would never have dared speak so boldly alone. The girl herself, pale in the upstairs window, pressed her face to the glass and saw them her neighbors, the same ones who had turned away in shame and fear, now standing with torches high, and for the first time since the day the vows were spoken, she felt not only the fire of her own defiance, but the warmth of others rising with it. Inside, the Baron raged, his voice muffled through the walls, barking orders at the hired men who shifted nervously in the hall, none eager to step into the torchlight of a crowd whose patience was burning to embers. The sheriff clenched his jaw, his hand brushing the butt of his revolver, though he did not draw, for he knew that this night was no longer about coin nor cattle but about the soul of the frontier itself, and whichever way the balance tipped toward silence bought in silver or toward justice demanded in fire would decide not just the girl's fate but the town's, and perhaps his own, forever. When dawn bled slow and pale across the horizon, the torches burned low, their embers curling into smoke that drifted over the ranch yard, and the house that once stood as a fortress of fear now looked hollow, its windows shattered by stones, its door battered down not with bullets alone but with the weight of a town that had finally decided its silence was worth less than its soul. Whether it was the Baron's own pistol that misfired in the chaos, or the deputy's rifle that went off when his hands shook, or the sheriff's grim decision at last to step into the light and end the tyranny with his own revolver, no one could say with certainty, and by sunrise the story was already shifting in the telling. But what mattered was this: the old man lay stripped of his power, his wealth scattered, his voice silenced, the badge that had protected him turned cold in the dirt beside him. The sheriff, face gray with the knowledge that no coin could outweigh the fire in the people's eyes, declared it finished, calling it justice to soothe his own conscience, though those gathered knew it was not the law that had delivered judgment but the people themselves, rising from years of bowed heads into one fierce night of defiance. The girl, her cheek still marred by the bruise that had sparked it all, her wrists raw from the grip of a man who believed he owned her, walked out through the broken door with her chin high and her eyes unflinching, her silence louder than any hymn sung in the church. And though she bore scars on her skin, in her heart they did not bend her. They made her blaze brighter. The women who had whispered her pain into the world stood with tears on their cheeks, some reaching to touch her hand as she passed, others lifting their children to see her, to remember that courage does not always roar, but sometimes endures until the right moment to rise. And the men, grudges now hardened into resolve, tipped their hats not out of habit but out of respect, for she had not only survived him, she had forced every soul in that town to reckon with what they had allowed in silence. No longer could they shrug and say that's the way of the frontier. No longer could they mutter pity in the dark and call it enough, for the girl's defiance had burned through their excuses, leaving them with a choice that could not be undone: to either live by the same silence that had chained her, or to stand when cruelty rose, no matter whose pockets it lined. The preacher's wife took her hand, guiding her down the church steps where the crowd parted as if she were leading a procession, not of mourning but of something fiercer reckoning, and as the sun crested full over the plains, it seemed the land itself breathed differently, the air cleansed by the fire of the night before. Whispers of what had happened would spread beyond the town, carried by drovers and peddlers until other settlements heard that one girl, barely 20, scarred but unbroken, had faced down wealth, law, and cruelty, and walked free. And though every retelling would shift, embroidering law where there had been defiance or softening the edges of violence, the truth remained carved in the hearts of those who had stood by torchlight. She had forced the frontier itself to look in the mirror of its silence, and what it saw could never again be ignored.